Wonderful. Well, we will go ahead and get started as we are a couple minutes past 2 p.m. I first just wanted to thank everyone so much for being here and taking the time to listen to this webinar. Um, I also wanted to welcome all those from outside the Power Nature Coalition and who may have heard about Power Nature from, an email being forwarded or also the EPIC listserv. Power Nature is a coalition of just under 300 different environmental groups and tribal organizations, community groups, and land trusts, all working together to make 30 by 30 a reality in California. 30 by 30 is both an international and California state codified goal to protect 30% of land in coastal waters by the year 2030. In the chat is a link to sign up for the coalition. Through this, you'll receive a monthly e-newsletter, be kept up to date with California's 30 by 30 initiative, receive information about upcoming grants, and join any of our regional and/or topical groups like public lands, freshwater, communications, and governmental relations. Next, I want to introduce our amazing panelists who are taking the time out of their busy days to come speak to us about elk on California's North Coast. Our first presenter is Carrington Hilson, who is an environmental scientist with CDFW's Northern region, who focuses exclusively on elk research, monitoring, and management in Del Norte, Humboldt, and Mendocino counties. Carrington also spends just as much time working with people as she does with elk, helping to resolve conflicts with ranchers and private property owners, working with state and federal land managers, tribal partners, as well as big game hunters. Carrington will give us an update today on how elk populations are doing on the North Coast. Thank you so much for being here, Carrington.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Yeah. And our second, I can introduce Chance after your presentation.
No,
actually.
go ahead.
Oh, okay. Our second speaker will be Chance Cutrano, who is the Director of Programs at the Resource Renewal Institute, RRI, where he works on large landscape conservation projects from the preservation of wildlife and public trust resources and national parks to the restoration of biodiversity and agricultural ecosystems. Chance will speak to the recent historic agreement on the Point Reyes National Seashore and how Tule elk management and advocacy have led to ecologically important lands being protected under 30 by 30. And after both the presentations, we will have a Q&A, but I will let Carrington take it away. Thanks, Carrington.
Of course. So I always like to start with a kind of a brief description of where we were, where we went to, and where we are now, right? So in regards to elk in California, we have 3 subspecies, so Tule, Rocky Mountain, and Roosevelt. I don't think a lot of people realize that the majority of our elk subspecies were almost extirpated from the state. So you can see from these maps, the historic range of elk was fairly extensive across the majority of the state. And then by the early 1900s is really when we saw that dramatic decline. And since then, we've seen substantial range increase and rebounding populations. And a lot of that has been done as efforts from the department to relocate and move specifically Tule elk around the state. So I like to note that in the early 1900s, it was actually a felony to harvest elk within the state of California. So it kind of shows how far we've come. If this was any other species, I think we'd think a little differently about them. So if this was a condor or a bald eagle, we would be faced with a conservation success story. But they're elk and they break fences and they compete with cattle. And so it kind of sets up a little different of a story for us here. So very briefly, 3 different subspecies, right? So Tule elk. So by 1870, we were down to 5 individuals in the San Joaquin Valley. Through conservation efforts, we have over 5,700 today, but when you think about it, historically, there were probably about 500,000. So we're not quite there yet. And with the way, things are down in Southern California, human occupancy probably will never allow that kind of historic abundance. So Roosevelt elk, we actually got down to about 100 or 200 individuals. Now we're seeing those, that subspecies of elk in majority of northeastern portion of the state. So Del Norte, Humboldt, Mendocino, and then over into Shasta, Siskiyou, and Trinity counties. Rocky Mountain elk, same sort of story. Historically low densities, we have about 1,500 today, and we are seeing their range kind of trickle down into Sierra and Plumas counties. So specifically what I was going to talk about today are our elk that exist in the North Coast and Mendocino EMUs. So the state has created 22 elk management units. And as you can see, the larger of these EMUs actually exist in the northern part of the state. And then the two that I'm talking about, I don't know if I can use my pointer over here. Here we are. So basically Del Norte down into Humboldt, that's one EMU, and then Mendocino is your other. Mendocino EMU has two different subspecies of elk. And let me find my pointer again. There we go. So in regards to what the department has done to allow these populations to rebound, so North Coast EMU is just our Rocky Mountain, Roosevelt elk. They were restricted to very small portions of Del Norte and Humboldt counties. We did have two capture and relocation efforts that took place in the 1900s, so 1947 to 1965. And they moved elk from Prairie Creek actually up into Del Norte County. Those translocation efforts were deemed unsuccessful. We also moved elk down to Mendocino from up in Prairie Creek, and that actually worked. So the elk that we have right now down in Sinkyone came from that relocation effort. And they are starting to spread out quite a bit more, and they're coming up into Whitethorn at this point. Tule elk, so we did 4 different relocations. The map isn't the best, it's a little dark, but we had Lake Pillsbury, Shamrock Ranch, Baxter Ranch, and Diamond H. And so those currently, the majority of those are all PLMs now. So one interesting thing to note, we've recently had some genetics research published. And so we went from very few elk on the coast, right? 100 to 200 individuals. What we're seeing up in Del Norte County is actually genetically those elk, it's range expansion from Oregon. So those elk came down. Then we did some relocations of elk from Prairie Creek. As I said, it worked down into Sinkyone. It also worked over further into the Marble Mountains. So the Marble Mountains, we actually pulled over 200 individuals from up in Oregon and from the coast. So those populations are doing quite well. And then we have this kind of wall of hybridization between the Rockies and the Rosies. And then we're also seeing a little bit of hybridization between the Roosevelt elk and the Tule elk in northern Mendocino. So I mentioned I kind of oversee the majority of the coastal counties, right? And so we have pretty robust project going on with several main objectives. One is just to get a minimum count and figure out how many cows, how many bulls, calves, spikes, etc. A lot of that work is done by putting GPS collars out. So by marking individuals within a group, I know what signifies a herd or subherd. I can look at movement. I can look at population connectivity. And then with that GPS collar data, it helps me define where I'm going out to estimate populations, right? So it kind of sets the boundaries for my survey efforts. So then we can look at population trends and do some novel techniques to estimate abundance, like fecal DNA or camera trap, like using time to event models. So the other thing that's really nice about getting these individuals collared, it gives us a lot of information, such as cow survival. When I get my hands on an elk, I can determine if they're pregnant. So we're getting pregnancy rates. And then if a collared individual dies, I get a mortality signal and I can pinpoint a lot of times the cause of death. We are also looking at disease prevalence. So that's a pretty big thing up in Del Norte County. We have treponine-associated hoof disease up there. We have identified that disease down through Humboldt County, but still the majority of cases are from up in Del Norte near Crescent City. And then finally, working to oversee some research between Cal Poly Humboldt and CDFW, a little bit with Caltrans and Washington State University. So I mentioned minimum count data. It seems easy, right? You just go out and count elk. Unfortunately, that is the case for a lot of the Western states, right? You can fly a helicopter, you can see, you can count them. It's not the case here on the coast. So steep terrain and dense vegetation prohibits the use of aerial surveys to get a count on our elk. Same situation with roads. You can't see very far off a lot of the roadways, and then there's not enough roads to access all locations where elk exist. So we have to kind of think outside of the box in order to achieve estimates of abundance here. That said, we do collect minimum count data. We do have routes set up. You can see for the North Coast, we are seeing an upward trend in numbers since we started counting in 2016. So a little bit of variation year to year is normal, right? And then we know every year it's not a census of the population. We're not counting them all. So some years, just weather conditions or locations of elk make it that we get a higher count. Mendocino is more difficult, and I think it's just because we have less elk, total elk that are along roadways that can easily be counted. You know, down in Laytonville, you drive through, you see them, but then you go through Potter Valley and you're only seeing maybe 1/6 of the total population from the roadway, if that. So we're having to rely on some supplemental information to really get at these numbers. So here we are with what we did for a camera trapping experience. So we used TTE, so time to event model. It's actually originally utilized, I think, for fish surveys. So it's the amount of time it takes for a camera to actually detect an elk, and then we can estimate abundance from that. So when you add up the numbers that we count along the coast and the numbers that we got from the cameras, we have about 2,500 elk between the inland areas where you really can't survey, and then the coast where you can see from the roads. In Mendocino, we are pretty reliant on aerial surveys. So over the years, the minimum counts are always kind of low. And then finally, when you look at our aerial surveys, we're getting closer to 1,500 elk, so quite a bit more. So GPS collars, to date, we've put out 176. The majority of those have actually been in Humboldt County. Just there's a ridiculous number of elk in Humboldt County in comparison to Del Norte. Mendocino, we started a little later, so we didn't start putting collars out until 2022. So I have a bin right now of collars that are ready for deployment this summer and into the fall. So these collars are giving us this spatial data. So here's Bronte and Bridge home range analysis of all of these collared individuals. So Del Norte County, you can see like this group goes all the way up into Oregon and around. Northern Humboldt, Central Humboldt, and then down into Mendocino. So we don't currently have all elk herds collared. So we are missing some elk in Covelo, and we're missing some elk down in Eden Valley. and there's elk down even south of the 36, down into like Alder Point, Blocksburg area. There's another herd over here called Domini. So that's what I spend my winters doing, is tracking down these uncollared groups of elk and do my best to get this data. So we mentioned, or I mentioned earlier, that our elk populations are doing quite well. I always like to remember kind of what is influencing our populations, because it's different as you move across the state and between the different subspecies. So you have things that are making the population decline, things that are increasing it, and then kind of the carrying capacity, which I know is kind of a dated term, but we have a lot of area within the northern part of the state that is suitable elk habitat that is currently unoccupied. So trying to figure out why we don't have elk occupancy in these areas that seem to be ideal habitat is really important. But on the coast, we have very high cow survival. So our collared cows are living for a long time, able to reproduce, and we have very high calf survival. So tons of pregnant cows, tons of babies on the ground, and those babies tend to survive into adulthood. We really don't have a lot of predation. We do see that calves under 14 weeks of age are predated upon by bears. And then we see a bit of mountain lion predation in the winter on our juveniles, on our calf elk. And then the number one cause of mortality actually on the coast is hunter harvest. So, and we do have a lot of roadkill, but it's not one of the top factors at this point. Oh, this slide is a little out of order. So I talked about this earlier, the fecal DNA, spatial recapture in the cameras. Distance sampling, that's the thing we do down when we have enough occurrences of elk across the landscape. We're able to utilize distance sampling from a helicopter and get an estimate of abundance. So conflict. So I mentioned earlier that if these were condors, I think people would be a lot less bothered by them. But elk tend to make their presence on the landscape known. So between being on the roadways, causing vehicle collisions, breaking down fences, eating apple trees, competing with cattle for forage, destroying hay crops, they can leave their mark. So a large part of my job is figuring out how to manage that conflict. So when I look at the management objectives for elk on the coast, it's kind of contradictory. So on one hand, I want to increase elk habitat and support range expansion of our elk. But on the flip side of that, I also want to reduce conflict and reduce and stabilize elk populations in areas with conflict. So it's the majority of our conflict is limited to the coast, even though, a lot of our ranchers are experiencing, they have to have less cattle on the landscape just because of the competition with the elk. They have less habituated elk. So it makes it a little easier to push them, off of the landscape and move them around. But it's a constant juggling act of how to manage this population with these conflicting goals. And one thing I'm really trying to do is reach out for help, right? So what are the solutions and what partnerships can I maintain to get both of those things done? So in regards to conflict, one of the only tools I really have currently for management of high density elk populations is through regulated hunting. So we have several different types of hunts. So we have our public draw tags, which consists of the which consists of general tags, and then in combination with that, we have the Shared Habitat Alliance for Recreational Enhancement tags. So those share tags I tend to place predominantly in areas of high conflict along the coast. We recently increased the number of landowner tags. So those are specific to an individual that has elk on their own property. And so it's nice for someone that has elk around to have the capacity to harvest. And then we also have our PLM tags, or private land management. And that's an area where the department is in contract with these private landowners to actually complete habitat restoration that a lot of times benefit elk specifically. So recently, we've increased the number of tag allotments on the coast quite a bit. Our hunt structure was kind of redone. So areas that used to be open to public hunting became part of the PLM program. And then we've increased the number of share tags substantially, and landowner tags, to kind of try to deal with these dense populations of elk along the coast. And to give you an idea, so now that I have collar data, right, I can look at where the herds are on the landscape and pinpoint properties that are specific to these elk. And I can put the number of tags within certain hunts in order to hopefully manipulate these high conflict herds. So moving forward, really want to see more habitat improvement. A lot of that, we're looking at prairie restoration, oak woodland, forest thinning, fuels reduction. So looking up in Del Norte, the National Forest Service is working on Jeffrey Pine Meadow restoration, which could be very beneficial to elk. Taloadini Nation got a grant to restore some habitat up there to open up some prairies. Going further south, Bureau of Land Management for Lax Creek, they got some money to do some prairie restoration as well as forest thinning. And I know UROC has done some prairie restoration as well, up a little closer to the Klamath River. And so always just looking for ways that we can open up that habitat to allow for range expansion and occupancy of elk in areas where they are desired. The PLMs, as I mentioned earlier, they're under contract to open up habitat. And it's not always elk. Some of our PLMs that have elk tags have done stream bed restoration to benefit salmon. So, but they're doing something, right, to benefit conservation as a whole. The other thing that I really want to focus more on is fencing. If property owners are constantly fixing fences, I think if they weren't fixing fences, they would maybe welcome elk a little more on the landscape. So looking at wildlife friendly fencing where elk can pass over or under without tearing the fencing down and keeping livestock secure. And finally, future planning to control densities. We are looking at the possibility of culling some of our herds, as well as continuing with hunting to really keep that pressure on some of these dense populations. And so I think we were having a Q&A at the end, so I can forego the questions now.
Thanks, Carrington.
Of course.
Chance, you said you had slides, right?
Yeah. I will
Wonderful.
switch over here to the slides, and we will try to cruise through them fairly quickly and get over to this Q&A.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Can you see my screen all right?
Yep. Looks perfect.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. My name is Chance Cutrano. I am the Director of Programs at the Resource Renewal Institute, located in Fairfax, California in Marin County, ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok. I'm going to chat a little bit about some of the lands further south that contain some amazing elk populations, in addition to the ones that Carrington was just chatting about. So for the last decade plus, I've been lucky enough to be involved in the national campaign to protect and restore Point Reyes National Seashore. And that has culminated in a recent announcement of a 2025 voluntary settlement agreement between a bunch of parties. There have been a lot of conflicts over the Point Reyes Peninsula for many decades, really since its inception, because of the tensions between ongoing leasing of commercial beef and dairy ranching operations and some of the other resource management considerations inherent within the enabling legislation that created the National Park Unit in the first place. And Tule elk are a critical through line, both for my personal involvement, our organization's involvement, and the larger consciousness around what was happening out at Point Reyes and this turning point we've been provided in the beginning of this year, which is really exciting. One point before I get into it, just to say, my first experience with elk in California, I was lucky enough as a little boy to travel with my parents to hit a collection of national parks in the Western United States. And one of those was going to Redwoods National Park, but specifically getting to actually go to Prairie Creek and camp at Gold Bluffs Beach, and camp on the beach and wake up in the morning and see Roosevelt elk in my campground. And you can imagine, as like a 8-year-old or a 9-year-old kid, just the like amazement, especially I grew up in Chicago. So the amazement of being not only on the Pacific coast on a beach camping with my parents, but also being able to see these amazing animals that had like tree branches growing out of their heads, grazing and browsing around my campsite. It blew my mind, and I think it set me on a particular course trajectory for my entire life. So anyway, just wanted to flag that because I think about that a lot, and I think about how people in a major urban area like San Francisco or the Bay Area, with access to a place like Point Reyes National Seashore, how young kids and families can have these phenomenal experiences with places so close to home. So with that said, I will go into with a little brief outline, just introduction, some timeline and context of what's happened at Point Reyes, the major changes that are occurring, the benefits that'll be conferred, public access and recreation, a little bit of a touch on that too, because that's important within the context of 30 by 30, not just conservation and restoration of lands and waters by 2030, but also how do we increase outdoors for all? And then also just implementation oversight, and then we can get in that Q&A. So this is just a quick thing. This is for the recording. If you want to go back and look at it, I don't expect you to read through all this, and it's not perfect either, but this is just a brief introduction timeline. The Point Reyes Peninsula had been stewarded since time immemorial by the Coast Miwok. And then there was a Spanish mission era that ultimately lent itself to a lot of ranch hands, ranch workers, even attorneys in San Francisco taking control of the land over time, but continuing to operate them as ranches up until the National Seashore Protection Movement in the 1930s began to build, culminating here at Point Reyes in 1962 with the establishment of the National Seashore. And then in 1972, a decade later, some funding that was used to finalize the acquisition of a lot of the ranches that were right in the center in what we now know is the pastoral zone of the National Seashore, where current beef and dairy ranching take place. There have been further amendments, but really a breaking point for the business as usual scenario, where these sort of like drought as the new abnormal becoming ever more apparent at a place like Point Reyes. And specifically between 2012 and 2014, historic droughts that led to mass die-offs of wildlife at the National Seashore, including the Tule elk that had been reintroduced to the seashore, which I'll get into in a minute. Our organization participated in processes with the National Park Service leading up to what was ultimately a federal complaint against the business as usual scenario in light of these mass die-offs of Tule elk. Because what we started to discover is that in terms of management of the national park, the die-off of Tule elk were kind of just the tip of the iceberg, but they were sort of a canary in the coal mine or an elk on the seashore. But nonetheless, it led to a much broader discussion, not only a settlement with the Park Service to contemplate a variety of alternatives for the future of this national park unit, but also a massive public input process where people really poured their hearts and souls into their vision for the future of this national park, the future of Tule elk on the coast in Marin County and beyond, and ultimately the settlement that was announced in January of this year. So Carrington touched on these maps. I wanted to acknowledge, like, the original estimated historical distribution, where we were in the 1970s and how that ultimately resulted in elk coming back to a place like Point Reyes. The elk are this symbolic species similar to the condor that we literally just, like the Tule elk, we almost lost them from the face of the earth entirely. They really came back from the brink of extinction. And when we say that, it's kind of an amorphous thing, but like we're talking about like 30 elk found on one ranch that were ultimately brought back through different relocation programs and got us to this point where we're now talking about elk management units all over California, and including Point Reyes. One of the interesting things that you'll note on this map, the final map on the right, is there are a couple of green dots that don't really have EMUs per se, but these are the confined herds, one of which are the elk at Point Reyes National Seashore. And there is a herd at the northern end of the Point Reyes Peninsula that was where they were relocated for their rehabilitation and reintroduction to this part of their former ecosystem and former range. Unfortunately, because they were behind this fence that separated them from the rest of the ecosystem, they were subject to this sort of artificial island effect, where there were massive boom and bust cycles based on resource constraints, based on precipitation fluctuations. So you might see years where the population at the northern end of the peninsula would boom to hundreds and hundreds of elk. Then you might have a drought condition like we saw between 2012 and 2014. And there was 50% die-off of these elk, whether it was from starvation or from lack of water, so dehydration, or some compounding effect from the drought on the other impacts, mineral deficiencies from extended periods of beef and dairy operations, and also the elk that were reintroduced to Point Reyes very quickly had succumb to this thing called Johne's disease, which, if you're familiar with elk management elsewhere in the Western United States, you might be familiar with things like brucellosis. And these are cattle-borne illnesses that then become a vector that kind of flip-flops between wildlife and animal agriculture and creates a lot of stress, both for private landowners and ranchers on working lands that are trying to make a living, as well as agencies that are managing natural resources and wildlife for their own health. These sorts of like chronic wasting diseases have plagued a lot of elk populations throughout the Western United States, and Point Reyes was no different. So they were really suffering behind this fence. Meanwhile, some initial efforts to relocate them elsewhere in the peninsula, towards the southern end, the Philip Burton Wilderness, there were successful relocation efforts to create free-ranging herds at Point Reyes. Many of those elk populations did not suffer during these droughts, unlike the elk that were behind these fences. So we're left with this sort of paradox at Point Reyes. In 2015, what do we do? I'm sorry to share this second image here and not give a little bit of a trigger warning, but these are the sorts of experiences that park visitors were coming into contact with during drought conditions, both 2012 to 2014, but also in 2019, 2020, there was another drought that was picking up, and people started to encounter lots of dead elk in the northern part of the peninsula as well. And there were just a lot of complications with, visitors coming to the park, which was sort of delineated by about 340 miles of barbed wire fences, and trying to make sense of, what is this national park? What could it be? What are the challenges? How do we overcome those challenges? For our organization, we believed that there was really this opportunity. We call it a turning point for Point Reyes. Like, what would the seashore look like during a planning process that would both further this sort of burgeoning idea of 30 by 30 to not only find new lands for protection or preservation, but also to create better durability within protected lands that were already experiencing resource challenges, et cetera. It's like, why take on even more management throughout the state if we can't even manage the things that we already hold dear to us and that we've cherished for so long? So we were, our organization was looking at an alternative that put out into the future some sort of phase out of a lot of the commercial activity, and at least the prioritization of natural resource protection, wildlife management, over and above commercial economic activity within the national park. Some of these things included, snowy plover habitat restoration, et cetera, but also the expansion of the Tule elk population beyond that fence at the northern end of the peninsula to allow for a full free-ranging herd to run across the entire peninsula for the first time since really since colonialism took hold here. So there are a bunch of other opportunities and benefits for interpretation, historic and adaptive use, et cetera. But the general public really latched onto this idea of elk being a symbol of regeneration of this landscape, a new storytelling, a restorying of this national park unit in some ways, and shining a light on some of the other important things, whether it's indigenous stewardship and cultural resource districts, or management of the elk, generally speaking, so that they aren't experiencing these mass die-offs behind fences, et cetera. There were thousands and thousands of public comments to this point, both to the National Park Service during this period and to the California Coastal Commission, which had to review the plans. I believe it was the largest outcry for a single issue ever to the Coastal Commission in terms of public comments. I think roughly 45,000 public comments were made, a lot of them about the Tule elk and wanting to protect this coastal resource. And ultimately, that led to an announcement from the park that they're going to continue the business as usual, but it also led to litigation from our organization and a couple others sort of challenging that business as usual scenario, and really questioning that based on all of the public sentiment, based on what we know about changing climatic conditions on the ground, the impacts to some of these wildlife species. Ultimately, a whole slew of ranchers, beef and dairy ranchers in Point Reyes proper and in the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, the plaintiffs and the National Park Service for several years sat around a table and tried to work out some solution that would work for everybody. The Nature Conservancy also got involved in that process as well and acted as a sort of mediator in a way. We had an official mediator, but they were trying to find a solution as well as a sort of third party that hadn't been stuck in years and years of conflict at the park. And ultimately, there was an announcement in January, 12 commercial ranching operations in the park decided to voluntarily terminate their leases within the national park. So all 6 dairy operations and 6 cattle operations that are just running beef. So approximately 4,729 animal units to be specific, but also the cessation of silage mowing, overall grazing reduction for any future targeted grazing, just being very explicit about like resource management priorities, and then the wind down of all of the commercial agriculture within that those 12 operations by the end of the spring next year. So some other ranches will continue. So that's important consideration as well, is that while some decided to leave, another collection decided that they would stay and they would receive 20-year leases and some diversification to allow them to weather some of those drought conditions and to, you know, better manage their lease. And as a result, obviously, there's going to be a lot of new attention, new focus on protection of native species, restoration of coastal prairie ecosystems, which have been decimated all along the coast, as well as coastal wetlands. Water quality improvements were a cornerstone for the Coastal Commission and the National Park Service as well. And then, of course, why we're here talking about this, enhanced wildlife movement. So Tule elk management, no longer arbitrary population limits to just kill anything above a sort of arbitrary capacity threshold, like they said, 140 free-ranging elk, let's say, close to the Point Reyes Lighthouse. They would just, anything above that, they would kill them. It wasn't based on any sort of science or carrying capacity. It was just kind of like, that's what's out there, and we're going to pass a plan saying status quo. So from this point on, there's no lethal removal or arbitrary population thresholds. We're going to see changes in actual fence management, the removal, a lot of the 340 miles of barbed wire fencing, which wasn't wildlife friendly to begin with. And then for the first time, as I mentioned before, all these different herds within the park, especially the herd at the northern end, will be able to connect with each other. Just before the settlement was announced, in a separate planning process, the National Park Service announced they would be removing that 8-foot fence that was like the elk fence that bifurcated the peninsula and kept that confined herd confined at the northern end. So there will be a lot of opportunities to work to enhance traditional ecological knowledge in terms of elk management, prescribe burn to help manage grasslands as they transition from annuals to more perennial grasslands, and more native scrub coastal ecosystems. And then again, there's going to be a targeted grazing program that will have fewer cows, focused on restoration seasonally to help manage some of the non-native and invasive plant species through this transition. Of course, changing all this will mean there will be new public access and recreation opportunities as well. Expanded day use overnight facilities, new trail networks for hiking, biking, equestrian use, maybe new campsites for those families that make their way out to the coast from across this country and across the world and get to have a magical experience like I did when I was a little boy, seeing elk just existing on the beach. And for a visual here, so this is what the seashore looked like, the land in question we're talking about. All of this stuff in yellow, those are all of the beef and dairy ranches that were existing and still exist currently, all the commercial operations. The purple was a scenic landscape zone where there was a free-ranging herd of elk, and the gray areas to the north here is the confined herd. And this all to the south was a wilderness area, and there are some elk, free-ranging elk to the south here as part of that successful relocation program. You can see, here's another image that shows these populations with these shading. So the sort of base where these herds were, little dots that show how far that range could go. Obviously, this elk reserve up here didn't allow for free movement because it was conflicting with some of the leased land for agriculture. And what we see now, this land in purple is all the land that will be transitioning away from commercial agriculture in the national park and toward restoration opportunities, and obviously something that our organization cared a lot about, making sure that there was a large landscape linkage so that all of these populations would be able to connect for the first time again, to spread genetic diversity, and then eventually many decades down the line, possibly lead to some translocation, relocation for Iones-free elk to other populations to continue to spread genetic diversity throughout the state of California is like a hope and dream of ours, because this species has been really bottlenecked because they weren't able to be moved because they encountered this illness when they were translocated out here. This was something that was exciting for us when we not only were trying to figure out 30 by 30, but also trying to figure out what could a little organization do to address the 2018 California Elk Management Plan from CDFW, which one of its goals was to eliminate one of the confined herds within the next cycle. And so this that hope and dream that a little organization and a group of people that cared a lot about this from across California would be able to make a little difference in addressing that. And lo and behold, that's coming to fruition here. And also the strengthening of the 30 by 30 elements, both for public access, but also the restoration component, making sure that durably protected lands actually do what we say they're going to do, that they'll durably protect these resources for current and future generations. Moving forward, lots of monitoring, lots of tribal consultation, co-stewardship with the federally recognized tribe out here, the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, as well as other stakeholders, and more public transparency through the release of a lot of documents that when we started this, those documents weren't published publicly on any government stuff. We had to fight to get all these documents and share them with the public to move this along. But it's just a case study of, how you can start working at something, you see something is wrong, or something doesn't seem quite right in terms of the way things are managed, and sticking with it, persevering, fighting for the integrity of these elk and the health of these populations. It leads to a brighter future for all the stakeholders involved, being able to finally sit in the conflict and talk through it and come up with a solution that really does right by this national park. So thank you very much. That's my time on this presentation.
Thanks so much, Chance. There are a ton of questions in the chat. I'm wondering if folks want to raise their hand and read them off, or if you want me to read them. I think it would be better if folks raised their hand to read them, so I didn't have to scroll while there's new messages. Any takers? There was one. Oh, Nico.
Greetings, thanks. That was great. Yeah, two questions. One, considering that wolves are considered the historic predator specialist of elk, can we expect much increased sort of migratory behavior based on predation behavior? And secondly, why doesn't California suppose have something equivalent to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation? Why is there no dedicated civic and NGO or equivalent? Thank you.
Yeah, we do have a local chapter for RMEF here in California, and they're very supportive of research efforts so far up in Northern California. The difference between migratory and non-migratory herds. So Rocky Mountain elk tend to be migratory. Roosevelt's, we have kind of a split. We have some that are non-migratory, some that are actually moving up and down into Oregon on an annual basis. I don't know that that's truly driven by predation. I think it's more of a learned behavior in those herds. So I guess we'll see what happens in the long term, right, with our wolf population coming back.
Oh, how do I get connected to the California chapter?
I don't know. I would look online, probably on their website.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of questions about wolves. There was also a question about somebody who owns a ranch in the town Elk, and are there options for encouraging elk on your property? Good question.
Of course, people can encourage elk occupancy. Elk tend to really gravitate towards edge habitat and areas that are grazed by cattle. So not having things completely overgrown and maintaining that diversified landscape.
Nice. Somebody asked a question for Carrington. Why do you think that the Sinkyone elk are moving into Whitethorn, where they have the wilderness area, when they have the wilderness area where there is lots of grass? I have noticed there's a lot of invasive species such as broom, tansy ragwort, wild radish, mustard, and thistle in the state park. Is that contributing to that seasonal move?
So I know the state park recently burned, I think it was this past season, I think to kind of control some of those invasive species. I do think some of the movement is related to numbers. So we've seen an increase in that herd. And so I think they're branching out to try to get more forage opportunity.
Nice. Anyone else brave enough to ask a question? Rick.
Yeah, hey, I'm expecting the elk populations at Point Reyes to soar now. They were doubling every 3.5 years until the drought and the Park Service failed to give them water. Where are they going to expand their range? And when do we worry about them getting to Highway 101 and a wildlife crossing?
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear what Carrington has to say about that stuff. What I would say is we expect that the populations will increase in the coming decades. To that maybe we'll get to that point of questions around threshold. It's not clear to me if we'll encounter similar issues where there. I mean, Point Reyes Peninsula is kind of, it's like almost like an island in its own way. So will there be boom and bust cycles as we get there? But also during the droughts, there were actual inquiries from other land managers, whether it's the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, but also Marin Municipal Water District about relocation of elk to some other places, which is a thorny question as well. So I'll be curious as those challenges present themselves in the next 10 to 15 years, where we'll be at in a state of landscape connectivity. There are organizations working in Marin County around wildlife crossings and looking to the good work that's happening down in LA and other places around wildlife crossings and large landscape connectivity. So, if 30 by 30 or some version of it succeeds over the coming decades, we might be at a place where those linkages in the landscape will reveal themselves and become a lot clearer. But I'm also curious, and maybe it's a good time to pass to Carrington, should there be Jonas-free populations at Point Reyes? Is there an opportunity for translocation of some of those as part of a statewide network of genetic diversity improvement? And is that one of the tools we have to slow down that rate of growth? But anyway.
Yeah, the department still is actively moving Tule elk. The majority of movement is from captive herds. So I would imagine that would be a possibility, but there's a lot that goes into it. And then partnership outside of the department in order to make that happen. So.
Brian?
Hey, thanks so much. I'm Brian Largay. I'm the land trust of Santa Cruz County, so Central Coast. But we're really excited about some of the progress that's been shown here. In our experience, progress like this is super exciting. It's also potentially fragile if there's not a broad and deep coalition. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about the working lands operators or other non-traditional conservation groups that may have been, how are things going with that sector of the population, that constituency? It makes me a little worried to think of political decisions that can be reversed when the politics, swing the other way. And I wonder if you might just talk about building a big tent and bringing ranchers and sportsmen or others on board. Thank you.
maybe maybe I could lead off with it since there was a lot of coalition building, but I think both of the examples that are being shared in some ways lend themselves to different types of coalition building. I think within the national park, there are a lot of different environmental, but also social justice organizations, and then of course the tribe coming in and talking about Tule elk as a cultural resource was an important piece of the puzzle for us. And so sort of seeking out that engagement and trying to make sure that there are a lot of diverse voices at the table. That's obviously highly recommended in order to have some sort of durable coalition. But within a national park, there are like certain laws that exist that have to be upheld and can't just be ignored. I think outside, when we're talking about like, that sort of rural green belt around protected lands where there are private landowners that are coming into conflict with wildlife like elk, that's a whole different sort of coalition building that takes place as well. And probably a lot more listening, a lot more patience, a lot more creative thinking to come to similar outcomes and to provide some sort of support to these private landowners to have win-win solutions. But yeah, Carrington, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's difficult when the majority of elk exist on private lands. And so we currently have a group that was put together by a group up in here in Humboldt, and we have, conservation groups, we have timber companies, we have private ranchers, we have national park, Caltrans has shown up, the university. So we're trying to get everybody's input as we move forward to better manage the species across the landscape. And we're realizing that there's not one answer, and there's not one solution that suits everyone. So it's more of like a tool bag of things that we can do. So it's not like hunting is not just the answer, right? And habitat restoration is not just the only answer. So we're really trying to be creative.
And one thing I would just add, Brian, just that came to mind and is like a sort of a more recent update since a lot of these slides. So one of the challenges with especially federal lands and resource management is the sort of flip-flopping of priorities depending on the administration you're under. And even since this settlement, even though it was brokered with ranchers and a lot of different parties that had skin in the game, the federal administration and House Republicans have expressed questions and concerns about how the settlement came to take form that would allow for the free movement of elk and the restoration of some of these ecosystems. And so there's currently a House congressional inquiry led by the Natural Resources Committee and House Republicans, Bruce Westerman from Arkansas in particular, to try to figure out, how did this all come to be? So it's one of the challenges of the federal side of things. Like there's, you have to figure out more tools in your toolbox on the private land side of things, but even on the federal side, you have different sort of risks in terms of durability.
Thanks, Chance. Somebody had a question in the chat. Can elk ever replace beef as a protein? I'm just wondering if farmers are into that idea as a way to earn money and reduce conflict. It's a cool question.
So, fortunately, I think fortunately, we don't have the capacity in California to farm elk. So, which is good for disease transmission, right? We do have private ranchers that will sell tags specific to their property, so landowner tags or access to their properties for general tags, or they'll enroll in the the PLM program to have elk harvested, and it does make money, right? At the end of the day, they are getting a paycheck from this. So
And I think somebody else asked, do elk help keep down fuels during fire season? And do you work with landowners and fire departments in that way?
So I don't really think elk are contributing to fuels reduction just because that's kind of more landscape level, and tends, I think, to be beyond the browse capacity for an elk. I know having cattle on the landscape really does set up habitat well for elk. So maintaining that shorter grass is really ideal.
And somebody else asked if there are rules and laws. Also, I'm sorry, I know it's past 2 o'clock, so if the presenters have to hop off, I totally understand. But somebody did ask if there's, certain rules and laws about keeping a certain distance from elk in visitor centers and parks. Is there any rules about staying away from elk?
Not that I know of, but I know I see the rangers up in the national park up here, and they will yell at visitors to keep their distance, but I don't think there's any official rule about that.
Nice. I saw one answer that said it's good to keep about 2 full-size buses size distance from elk. But I live in Humboldt County and I'll go hiking and sometimes they're there and you can't get away from them.
Yeah, every year we have bulls that'll put holes in the side of vehicles, and we've had last 2 years we've had 2 individuals end up in the emergency room from being attacked by elk.
Oh, new fear unlocked.
Yeah, I wouldn't get close.
No, keep as much distance as possible, I suppose. Thank you so much, everybody, for staying, especially 3 minutes past the scheduled ending of this webinar. If you have any further questions that didn't get answered during today, you can email me and I'll put my email in the chat and I can try and connect you with the presenters, get you some answers. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
And
you.
big thank you to our presenters. You all were amazing.
Thank you so much for your time.